187 years ago, in an isolated plantation outside Memphis, Tennessee, military correspondence and local church records mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in deliberate silence. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the colonel's wife, disappeared from official records in the autumn of 1838, but not from the oral memory of the enslaved community. Her absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that only now begins to be revealed through fragments discovered in the ruins of a forgotten chapel. The plantation sat on 300 acres of cotton fields where 70 enslaved people worked under the command of Colonel James Whitmore, a decorated veteran of Indian campaigns who spent most of his time away on military assignments. In his absence, his wife Eleanor managed the estate with an iron fist, but also with something darker, an obsession with ancient rituals and forbidden knowledge that would transform 6 lives into a secret, too dangerous to speak aloud. When archaeologists from the University of Memphis excavated the abandoned chapel's foundation in 2023, they found something that challenged everything documented about the Whitmore plantation. Beneath the altar stones lay 6 iron boxes, each containing personal belongings, locks of hair, and fragments of documents written in a cipher that took historians 2 years to decode. The revelation was devastating. Eleanor Whitmore had created a blood pact with 6 enslaved individuals, binding them in a ritual that promised freedom but delivered only horror and eternal silence. The official records say Mrs. Whitmore died of fever in October 1838. The enslaved community's oral tradition tells a different story, one of full moon ceremonies in the chapel, of screams that echoed through cotton fields, of 6 people who vanished the same night Eleanor disappeared, and of a secret so toxic that speaking it aloud meant death. For generations, descendants carried this burden without understanding its full weight, until documents hidden in an attic trunk and bones buried beneath sacred ground forced the truth into daylight. This is not just a story about one plantation or one woman's madness. It's a testament to how institutional power erased crimes, how silence became survival, and how the enslaved people's memories preserved what the powerful tried to destroy. The chapel ruins guard secrets that official history refused to record, and the 6 iron boxes contain evidence of a crime that transcended ordinary cruelty. Before we continue, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The Colonel's Absence. Colonel James Whitmore left Memphis in March 1838 for what would become a 6-month military campaign along the Arkansas border. His departure marked the beginning of Eleanor Whitmore's complete control over the plantation, and with it, the start of events that would haunt the property for nearly 2 centuries. Eleanor was not a typical plantation mistress. Born in New Orleans to a Creole family with deep roots in Caribbean mysticism, she had arrived in Memphis 5 years earlier carrying trunks filled not just with fine dresses, but with books bound in leather containing symbols and rituals that respectable society would have condemned. The enslaved people on the Whitmore plantation quickly learned that Mrs. Eleanor was different. Her punishments were calculated, her rewards strategic, and her eyes held a hunger for something beyond cotton profits. The plantation operated with brutal efficiency under Eleanor's management. 70 enslaved people worked from dawn until dark, their lives measured in pounds of cotton picked, rows plowed, and tasks completed. But 6 individuals among them caught Eleanor's particular attention. Samuel, a blacksmith with knowledge of metalwork, passed down through African traditions. Rebecca, a midwife whose herbal knowledge was legendary. Thomas, a carpenter who could read despite laws forbidding it. Mary, a house servant who had learned French from Eleanor's books. Joseph, a field worker with a photographic memory. And Sarah, a young woman whose beauty and intelligence made her dangerous in a world that valued neither in enslaved people. According to fragments discovered in the chapel boxes, Eleanor began meeting individually with these 6 people in early April 1838. The meetings took place in the old plantation chapel, a stone building erected by the previous owner and rarely used since Colonel Whitmore preferred the town church. Eleanor told each of them the same story. She possessed knowledge of ancient rituals that could grant freedom, but the ritual required willing participants who understood they were making a pact that transcended earthly law. The concept of willing participation under slavery is a grotesque contradiction that Eleanor exploited with cold calculation. She offered something no enslaved person could refuse: documented freedom papers, money for passage north, and protection from slave catchers. The price was their participation in monthly ceremonies that Eleanor claimed would bind their fates to hers and create a spiritual protection that would ensure the ritual's success. Letters discovered in Eleanor's trunk, decoded by cryptographers in 2024, reveal her true intentions. She believed that by mixing her blood with that of 6 enslaved individuals during specific lunar phases, she could absorb their vitality and knowledge while binding them to eternal servitude, not just in this life, but in whatever existed beyond. The ritual combined elements of Caribbean voodoo, European occultism, and Eleanor's own twisted interpretations of power and possession. The first ceremony took place on the full moon of April 1838. According to the decoded documents, Eleanor had the 6 participants gather in the chapel at midnight. She had prepared the space with symbols drawn in ash and salt, candles arranged in patterns she claimed were ancient, and 6 silver cups she had commissioned from Samuel's metalwork. Each cup bore a different symbol, and each participant would drink from their designated cup, a mixture that included wine, herbs, and most disturbingly, blood drawn from Eleanor's own arm. The enslaved community knew something was happening in the chapel. Workers passing by at night reported seeing candlelight through the cracks in the stone walls, hearing chants in languages they didn't recognize, and smelling incense that made them dizzy if they got too close. But fear kept them silent. Speaking about what the mistress did in her private time was dangerous, and protecting the 6 people involved meant not drawing attention to them. Samuel's daughter, who was only 8 years old in 1838, would later tell her own children that her father came back from the first ceremony different. He was quiet, withdrawn, and began marking strange symbols on the tools he forged. When she asked what happened in the chapel, he told her only that he had made a bargain with the devil wearing a white woman's dress, and that she should pray he lived long enough to warn others about the price of trusting promises from people who owned human beings. Eleanor documented each ceremony in her cipher journal, noting the phases of the moon, the reactions of the participants, and her observations of changes she believed she was seeing in herself. She wrote about feeling stronger, about understanding secrets of the African traditions that Samuel shared during their sessions, about absorbing Rebecca's herbal knowledge and Thomas's ability to solve complex problems. She believed the ritual was working, but by August 1838 something was going wrong. The participants were becoming ill. Mary began having seizures during the ceremonies. Joseph's memory, once photographic, started failing him. Sarah developed a fever that wouldn't break. Eleanor's journal entries became more frantic, more desperate. She increased the frequency of the ceremonies, moved from monthly gatherings to weekly sessions, and began adding new elements to the ritual. Elements that required more blood, more participation, more of whatever she believed she was extracting from these 6 people. The enslaved community watched in horror as the 6 grew weaker, but intervention meant death. The code of survival under slavery was clear. You protected yourself and your immediate family first, and you did not challenge the master or mistress openly unless you were ready to die. Chapter 2. The September Gathering. September 1838 brought an early cold snap to Memphis, and with it, Eleanor Whitmore's increasing desperation. The 6 participants in her blood pact were deteriorating faster than she had anticipated, and her journal entries reveal a woman spiraling into panic masked as religious fervor. She convinced herself that one final ceremony during the harvest moon would complete the ritual and solve everything. The plantation was at peak harvest activity, with every available person working 18-hour days to bring in the cotton crop before the weather turned. This made Eleanor's preparations for the September ceremony both easier and more dangerous. Easier because exhausted people asked fewer questions. More dangerous because any disruption to harvest could attract Colonel Whitmore's attention when he returned. Eleanor spent the first week of September gathering materials for what she called the completion ceremony. She ordered Samuel to forge 6 iron boxes, each large enough to hold a person's most precious possessions. She had Rebecca collect specific herbs, some medicinal, others toxic, and prepare them according to instructions in Eleanor's cipher books. She instructed Thomas to modify the chapel's interior, creating a sunken circle in the center where the ceremony would take place. The enslaved community began noticing changes that terrified them. The 6 participants stopped eating in the communal areas. Mary was seen carrying 6 white candles into the chapel, each one marked with symbols nobody recognized. Joseph spent hours digging beneath the chapel's altar stones, his hands bleeding from the work but his face blank, as if he was no longer in control of his own actions. According to testimony given by Eleanor's house servant Dinah to a traveling preacher years later, Mrs. Whitmore began talking to herself in the weeks before the final ceremony. She would stand at her bedroom window staring at the chapel, whispering in languages Dinah didn't understand. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating regular meals, and began wearing a necklace made of 6 small vials that she filled with dark liquid each morning. The other enslaved people on the plantation tried to intervene. A group of older women, including Rebecca's mother, approached Samuel and begged him to stop participating in whatever was happening. He looked at them with hollow eyes and said that it was too late, that the pact had already been sealed, and that running would only bring worse consequences. They asked what he meant by sealed, and he showed them a mark on his wrist, a symbol that looked like it had been burned into his skin, though he insisted he felt no pain from it. Rebecca's deterioration was the most visible. As the plantation's midwife, she had been robust and strong, capable of working all day and then attending birth through the night. But by mid-September, she could barely walk without assistance. Her skin had taken on a grayish tone, and her eyes seemed unfocused, as if she was seeing something beyond the physical world. When other women asked what Mrs. Eleanor was doing to her, Rebecca would only whisper that she had traded one kind of bondage for another, and that at least slavery ended with death. Eleanor's preparations reached a crescendo on September 20th. She ordered the 6 participants to bring their most precious possessions to the chapel, items that connected them to their families, their African heritage, or their hopes for freedom. Samuel brought tools his father had made. Rebecca brought herbs her grandmother had brought from Africa. Thomas brought a Bible he had taught himself to read despite it being illegal. Mary brought letters she had written to family members sold away years earlier. Joseph brought a drawing of his mother, executed from memory with remarkable detail. Sarah brought nothing, claiming that enslaved people owned nothing worth bringing. The iron boxes Samuel had forged were placed in the chapel, one for each participant. Eleanor told them these boxes would contain their earthly remains, not their bodies, but the physical objects that tied them to their mortal existence. She claimed that by willingly placing their treasures in these boxes and sealing them beneath the chapel, they would free their spirits to transcend the limitations of enslavement and merge with something greater. What Eleanor didn't tell them was that the ritual she planned required their deaths. Her cipher journal, decoded in 2024, contains explicit instructions for what she called the final transmission. She believed that at the moment of death during the full moon ceremony, she could absorb their life force completely and permanently, gaining not just their knowledge but their years of life, their vitality, and their spiritual strength. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The sealed journal entries from September 21st through 23rd detail Eleanor's final preparations. She prepared 6 cups containing a mixture of wine, crushed oleander flowers, nightshade berries, and other toxic plants that Rebecca had been forced to gather. The poison was designed to be slow-acting, allowing the ceremony to conclude before death occurred. Eleanor wrote that she would drink from a 7th cup containing only wine, allowing her to remain conscious while the others transitioned. On September 24, 1838, the full harvest moon rose over the Whitmore plantation. Eleanor summoned the 6 participants to the chapel at midnight, and what happened in those next hours would remain hidden for 185 years. Chapter 3. The Night of Silence. The full moon of September 24th, 1838, illuminated the cotton fields surrounding the Whitmore plantation with an ethereal glow that the enslaved community would later describe as ominous. Every person in the slave quarters knew something terrible was happening in the chapel. but fear and the unspoken rules of survival kept them in their cabins as midnight approached. Eleanor Whitmore entered the chapel at 11:30 p.m., carrying a leather satchel containing her cipher journal, 7 cups and vials of the prepared mixture. She had spent the afternoon in preparation rituals, bathing in water mixed with salt and herbs, dressing in white fabric she claimed was consecrated for the ceremony, and marking her own skin with symbols using ink mixed with her blood. The 6 participants arrived separately between 11:45 and midnight. Each had been instructed to approach from different directions to avoid drawing attention. Samuel came from the forge, his hands still blackened from his day's work. Rebecca was helped by 2 other women, who left her at the chapel door, tears streaming down their faces. Thomas walked from the plantation's carpentry shop, carrying his Bible. Mary slipped out of the main house where she had spent the evening serving Eleanor's dinner. Joseph came from the fields, still covered in cotton dust. Sarah was the last to arrive, her reluctance evident in every slow step. According to fragments found in the iron boxes and Eleanor's journal, the ceremony began with each participant standing at designated points around the sunken circle Thomas had created. Eleanor stood at the center, the 7 cups arranged on a small table before her. She lit 6 white candles, placing one before each participant, and began chanting in a language that combined French, African words she had learned from the participants, and Latin phrases from her occult texts. The ritual progressed through 3 phases. In the first phase, Eleanor cut her palm and allowed blood to drip into each of the 6 cups designated for the participants. She spoke about binding, about transcendence, about freedom through transformation. She told them this was their final ceremony, that after tonight they would be free. Not in the way they understood freedom, but in a way that transcended earthly limitations. In the second phase, each participant placed their precious possessions into their iron boxes: Samuel's tools, Rebecca's herbs, Thomas's Bible, Mary's letters, Joseph's drawing, and Sarah's empty box that she said represented the nothingness slavery had left her. Eleanor sealed each box with wax marked with their individual symbols, then had Thomas place them in the hollowed space beneath the altar stones. The third phase began when Eleanor distributed the 6 cups to the participants. She explained that drinking from these cups would complete the pact, would finalize their transformation, would grant them the freedom she had promised. She drank from the 7th cup, the one containing only wine, and watched as they followed her example. What happened next remains unclear from the historical record. Eleanor's journal ends abruptly after describing the participants drinking from the cups. The next coherent entries were written weeks later, and they contain only fragments, disjointed observations about silence, about the weight of 6 souls, about a transformation that went wrong. The enslaved community's oral tradition provides a different account. They speak of screams that came from the chapel around 1 a.m., screams that lasted only minutes before being replaced by an unnatural silence. They describe seeing Eleanor emerge from the chapel alone at dawn, her white dress stained with what looked like blood and soil, her eyes wild and unfocused. They remember that she walked directly to the main house, locked herself in her bedroom, and was not seen again for 3 days. When workers entered the chapel the next morning to prepare it for Sunday service, they found it empty except for the smell of burned herbs and melted wax. The sunken circle had been filled in, the altar stones showed no signs of disturbance, and the 6 participants were nowhere to be found. Their disappearance from the plantation records was immediate and absolute, as if they had never existed. The overseer, a man named Patterson who managed the plantation in Colonel Whitmore's absence, demanded explanations. Where were the 6 workers? Who gave them permission to leave during harvest? Eleanor emerged from her bedroom long enough to tell him that she had granted them freedom papers and sent them north, that it was her right as the colonel's wife to manage plantation affairs, and that questions about her decisions were inappropriate. Patterson documented his concerns in letters to Colonel Whitmore, fragments of which were discovered in military archives in 2019. He wrote about the peculiar circumstances surrounding the disappearance of 6 valuable workers, about Mrs. Whitmore's strange behavior and unnatural appearance, and about rumors circulating among the enslaved community that something terrible had occurred in the chapel. But Patterson also noted something more disturbing. The other enslaved people were terrified into absolute silence. When he tried to question them about the 6 missing individuals, they claimed not to remember anyone by those names. Children were hushed when they mentioned seeing the 6 people enter the chapel. Women who had been Rebecca's closest friends insisted they had never known anyone named Rebecca. The silence was complete, enforced not by punishment, but by terror. Chapter 4. The Colonel's Return. Colonel James Whitmore returned to his Memphis plantation in October 1838, expecting to find harvest completed and accounts in order. Instead, he found his wife bedridden with what the local doctor diagnosed as nervous fever. 6 valuable workers mysteriously vanished, and an enslaved community gripped by a fear so profound that normal plantation operations had nearly collapsed. The colonel was a practical military man with little patience for what he considered superstition or hysteria. He reviewed the plantation accounts and found them technically correct. Eleanor had documented selling the 6 missing workers to a trader headed to New Orleans, complete with forged receipts and transportation records. The documents claimed she had received payment in cash and immediately deposited it in the plantation's operating fund. But Colonel Whitmore was not easily fooled. The 6 individuals Eleanor claimed to have sold were skilled workers worth considerably more than the documented sale price. Samuel's metalworking skills alone would command premium rates. Rebecca's midwife knowledge was irreplaceable. The timing of the sale during peak harvest season made no economic sense. And most suspicious of all, Eleanor could provide no information about which trader supposedly purchased them or where they had been transported. When the colonel confronted his wife in her bedroom, he found a woman transformed from the composed, calculating person he had left in March. Eleanor was gaunt. Her hair had gone partially gray, and she spoke in disjointed sentences about packs and transformations and costs she hadn't anticipated. She insisted the 6 workers were gone to a place where they could never return, and that questioning their departure was dangerous for everyone involved. Military correspondence discovered in Tennessee State Archives in 2021 reveals that Colonel Whitmore wrote to his commanding officer requesting an extended leave due to family matters requiring immediate attention and investigation. In these letters, he mentioned concerns about his wife's mental state and irregularities in plantation management that may have legal implications. The colonel's investigation uncovered fragments of the truth. He found Eleanor's cipher journal hidden in her bedroom but couldn't decode it. He discovered unusual financial transactions, purchases of rare herbs, payments to Samuel for custom metalwork that wasn't documented in the forge records, and unexplained withdrawals from their account that Eleanor couldn't explain coherently. Most disturbingly, he found the chapel. Local oral tradition, recorded by a Baptist preacher who visited the plantation in the 1840s, states that Colonel Whitmore forced open the sealed entrance beneath the altar stones and found the 6 iron boxes. The preacher's journal, preserved in a Nashville church archive, describes the colonel's reaction. He emerged from that investigation a changed man, convinced of evil that transcended human cruelty. What exactly Colonel Whitmore found in those boxes was never officially recorded. The preacher wrote only that the colonel ordered the chapel sealed permanently, that he had the sunken circle filled with concrete, and that he forbade anyone from ever entering the building again. He then ordered Eleanor confined to her bedroom with round-the-clock supervision, claiming her nervous fever required isolation. The enslaved community watched these developments with mixed terror and cautious hope. Some believed the colonel might bring justice for the 6 disappeared people. Others feared that any investigation would only bring more danger to those who remained. The eldest members counseled absolute silence. Whatever the colonel learned or didn't learn, their survival depended on appearing to know nothing. In November 1838, Eleanor Whitmore died. The official record states natural causes related to her ongoing fever. The plantation doctor who signed the death certificate noted complications of a nervous disorder marked by delusions and progressive physical deterioration. She was buried not in the plantation cemetery with other family members, but in an unmarked grave on the far edge of the property, away from both the family plots and the enslaved people's burial ground. Colonel Whitmore's behavior after Eleanor's death suggests a man haunted by knowledge he couldn't share. He sold 40 acres of the plantation, including the land where the chapel stood, to a neighboring farmer. The deed of sale contained unusual provisions. The chapel must never be demolished or disturbed, and the land surrounding it must remain untouched. The farmer who purchased this parcel later told his family that the colonel had paid him to agree to these terms rather than charging him for the land. The colonel also made a decision that shocked Memphis society. He began the process of gradually freeing the enslaved people on his plantation. Tennessee law at the time made manumission extremely difficult, requiring legal proceedings and proof that freed individuals could support themselves. Over the next 3 years, Colonel Whitmore navigated these obstacles, documenting skills and arranging apprenticeships that would allow people to legally gain their freedom. Documents from the Tennessee Manumission Court show that by 1841, Colonel Whitmore had freed 27 individuals from his plantation, an unprecedented number for a single owner during that period. Each freed person's papers included specific references to their skills, character, and ability to be self-supporting. Legal language required by Tennessee law, but applied by Whitmore with unusual thoroughness. Why did the colonel take these actions? His letters to fellow officers suggest a man trying to atone for something he felt responsible for, but couldn't openly discuss. He wrote about crimes committed in the name of property rights and evils that persist when human beings are reduced to commodities. He never mentioned Eleanor's name in correspondence after her death, referring only to circumstances at home that revealed the true cost of our peculiar institution. The colonel died in 1845, 7 years after Eleanor and the 6 disappeared people. His will contained provisions for additional manumissions and funds to support formerly enslaved people in establishing themselves as free persons. Chapter 5. Generations of Silence. The story of Eleanor Whitmore and the 6 disappeared people became the kind of secret that communities carry across generations. Too dangerous to speak aloud, too significant to completely forget. For over 180 years, the truth lived in fragments, whispered warnings, coded stories, and a collective understanding that some questions were better left unasked. The families of the 6 disappeared individuals carried the heaviest burden. Samuel's daughter spent her entire life not knowing whether her father was dead or had somehow escaped to freedom. She was told conflicting stories, that he had run away north, that he had been sold to Louisiana, that he had died in an accident. Each story contained the same implicit warning. Don't dig deeper. Don't ask more questions. Don't risk bringing attention to yourself by seeking answers. Rebecca's children and grandchildren inherited her knowledge of herbal medicine, but also inherited a fear of practices that seemed too connected to African traditions. Rebecca's granddaughter, interviewed by a folklorist in 1891, spoke about how her grandmother went to work one night for the mistress and never came home, and how her mother taught her to never trust white people who showed interest in traditional healing methods. Thomas's literacy, the skill that had made him valuable to Eleanor, became both a blessing and a curse for his descendants. His son learned to read from Thomas's hidden lessons, but after his father's disappearance, the family carefully concealed this ability. Reading while enslaved was dangerous enough. Being known as the son of a man who disappeared under mysterious circumstances while possessing forbidden knowledge was doubly so. Mary's letters, the ones she had placed in her iron box before the ceremony, were written to family members sold away years earlier. Her younger sister kept copies of those letters, hoping someday to find the people Mary had addressed. Instead, the letters became relics of loss, evidence that Mary had existed, had hoped, had believed freedom was possible. The sisters' descendants preserved those letters through emancipation, through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, waiting for a time when seeking answers wouldn't be fatal. Joseph's photographic memory had been legendary among the enslaved community. His ability to recall exact details, to solve complex problems, to remember everything he heard or saw, had made him invaluable for passing information secretly among the enslaved. After his disappearance, people who needed to remember crucial information would say they were thinking like Joseph, a phrase that survived into the 20th century among Memphis's black community. though few remembered its origin. Sarah, the youngest of the six, left behind no children. Her sister's testimony, recorded by a Works Progress Administration interviewer in 1936, described Sarah as someone who knew her beauty would be her destruction and was right. The sister recalled Sarah's terror in the days before the final ceremony, and how Sarah had tried to run away 2 days before September 24th, but had been caught and brought back to the plantation. She told me the white woman had marked her, and the mark wouldn't let her leave, the sister said. I didn't understand then. Maybe I still don't. The chapel itself became a place of warning. After Colonel Whitmore sealed it and sold the land, the building stood abandoned. The farmer who purchased the property honored the colonel's agreement to leave it undisturbed, and each subsequent owner maintained this tradition. By the early 1900s, local children were told not to play near the old chapel, though few parents could explain exactly why. The building developed a reputation for being haunted, for causing illness in those who approached it, for being somehow wrong in ways that defied specific description. African American families in Memphis developed their own narratives about the chapel. Some claimed it was where a group of escaped slaves had been captured and murdered. Others said it was built over an old indigenous burial ground and cursed by spirits. Still others told stories about a white woman who made deals with the devil and trapped souls inside. None of these stories matched the literal truth, but all of them contained kernels of accurate warning. Stay away from that place. Don't ask too many questions about what happened there, and understand that powerful people once did terrible things that were never punished. The oral tradition among descendants of the Whitmore Plantation's enslaved community remained remarkably consistent across generations, even as specific details were lost or transformed. Researchers conducting oral history interviews in the 1970s found multiple families who mentioned the 6 who went into the chapel and never came out, though the dates, names, and exact circumstances had become confused over time. What remained clear was the emotional truth. 6 people made desperate bargains with someone who had power over them. Those bargains led to their disappearance, and the silence surrounding their fate was enforced by terror rather than consent. The descendants of the enslaved community understood implicitly what scholars would spend years trying to prove: that slavery created conditions where consent was impossible, where promises of freedom could mask unimaginable cruelty, and where the powerful could commit crimes and simply erase them from official history. By the mid-20th century, the Whitmore plantation had been subdivided into small farms. The main house had burned down in the 1920s, and the only remaining structure from the 1838 plantation was the chapel. Still standing, still avoided, still carrying secrets that nobody wanted to disturb. Urban development in Memphis during the 1980s and 1990s reached the old plantation lands, and developers began planning a shopping complex that would require demolishing several old structures, including the abandoned chapel. That demolition plan would finally force the truth into daylight. Chapter 6. What the Chapel Revealed. In 2023, the University of Memphis Archaeological Department received an emergency call from construction workers preparing to demolish the old chapel structure on what had once been the Whitmore plantation. The workers had discovered something beneath the chapel's foundation that they insisted wasn't natural, and they refused to continue work until experts examined the site. Dr. Carmen Foster, a specialist in antebellum archaeology, arrived expecting to find typical remnants of 19th century construction, perhaps some old bottles, buttons, or pottery fragments. What she found instead would become one of the most significant discoveries in the archaeological study of American slavery. Beneath the sealed altar stones, exactly where Thomas had hollowed out space in September 1838, lay 6 iron boxes arranged in a perfect circle. The boxes had been sealed with wax that still bore visible symbols, marks that Dr. Foster immediately recognized as inconsistent with typical Christian iconography. When the team carefully opened the first box, they found Samuel's metalworking tools, but also something more disturbing: a leather-bound journal fragment written in an elaborate cipher, and a lock of hair wrapped in cloth that DNA analysis would later prove belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. Each box contained similar elements: personal items belonging to the disappeared individuals, fragments of documents written in cipher, and physical evidence that tied them to Eleanor. Rebecca's box held herbs in a vial containing residue that toxicology analysis identified as a mixture of deadly plant compounds, including oleander and nightshade. Thomas's box contained his Bible with specific passages marked, and notes in the margins written in what appeared to be Eleanor's handwriting. Mary's box held her letters, still remarkably preserved after 185 years, providing the first concrete documentation that these 6 people had actually existed. The letters named family members, described specific events on the plantation, and referenced ceremonies in the chapel that Mary believed would lead to freedom. The last letter, dated September 23, 1838, ended with the sentence, "Tomorrow I will drink from her cup," and she promises that freedom comes through transformation. Joseph's box contained the drawing of his mother, but also something the researchers found more disturbing: detailed written descriptions of each ceremony leading up to the final gathering. Joseph had documented dates, moon phases, participants' declining health, and Eleanor's increasing desperation. His photographic memory had created a precise record of events, and he had apparently hidden this record in the box, knowing it might be the only evidence of what happened. Sarah's empty box turned out to be the most revealing. At the bottom, beneath where possessions would have been placed, researchers found a false bottom. Hidden in this space was a complete copy of Eleanor's cipher key and a 3-page letter Sarah had written the night before the final ceremony. The letter was addressed to "whoever finds this" and laid out explicit details about Eleanor's plans, the poison she was preparing, and Sarah's certainty that the September 24th ceremony was designed to kill them all. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of Samuel, Rebecca, Thomas, Mary, Joseph, and Sarah reach more people. Dr. Foster's team spent 2 years analyzing the contents of the boxes and decoding the documents using Sarah's hidden cipher key. What emerged was a complete picture of Eleanor Whitmore's final months, her deteriorating mental state, and the calculated way she had manipulated 6 people into participating in their own murders. The decoded journals revealed that Eleanor had genuinely believed in the ritual's power. She thought that by mixing blood with enslaved individuals, and then consuming their life force at the moment of their deaths, she could absorb their vitality, knowledge, and years of life. The ritual was supposed to be a transfer of power that would leave her stronger, and them transcended to a spiritual state she claimed was superior to earthly freedom. But Eleanor's own writings show her growing realization that the ritual was failing. The participants were dying slowly from repeated exposure to low doses of poison administered during the monthly ceremonies. Instead of gaining their knowledge and vitality, Eleanor was experiencing symptoms of the same poisoning, likely from handling the toxic compounds or from contamination during the blood-mixing portions of the ceremonies. The final decoded entries, written in the weeks after September 24th, show Eleanor descending into guilt-driven madness. She wrote about hearing voices from the chapel, about seeing the 6 people in her bedroom at night, about feeling their presence draining her life force instead of the reverse. She believed she had created a pact that bound her to their deaths, and that she was being pulled toward the same fate she had forced upon them. Physical evidence from the boxes corroborates this interpretation. Analysis of the residue in the cup showed that all 7, including Eleanor's, had contained some level of poison, suggesting she had been slowly poisoning herself throughout the months of ceremonies. The autopsy records from 1838, rediscovered in a Tennessee medical archive in 2024, showed that Eleanor died with symptoms consistent with chronic toxic plant poisoning. But the most disturbing discovery was what the boxes didn't contain: any trace of the 6 individuals' remains. Despite extensive excavation around the chapel site, no human bones were found. The archaeological team expanded their search to the entire original plantation footprint, using ground-penetrating radar and bringing in forensic specialists. But Samuel, Rebecca, Thomas, Mary, Joseph, and Sarah's physical remains were never located. The disappearance of their bodies raises questions that remain unanswered. Were they moved after death? Did Colonel Whitmore relocate them when he investigated the chapel? Were they buried in unmarked graves that later development destroyed? Or did something else happen on that September night that the historical record, even with all its newly discovered evidence, still cannot fully explain? Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore Plantation Chapel. See you in the next video.